One, two, three. Good afternoon, gentlemen. This is CS MGTOW. I'm very, very honored to have a guest with me today. His name is David Niose, and he is the former president of the American Humanist Association. He's also the author of multiple books, including Non-Believer Nation, The Rise of Secular Americans, and Fighting Back the Right, Reclaiming America from the Attack on Reason. And the discussion today is basically going to center around what happens when critical thinking is abandoned as a cultural value. There is usually a very, very large price to pay. And Mr. Niose is here to talk about the root for the abandonment of inquiry and reason, plus the possible consequences on our civilization. So David, I'll be very, very grateful if you can introduce yourself to our listeners and talk about how you became involved with the secular movements and, of course, the work of the American Humanist Association.
Sure. You did a pretty good job introducing me just now, so I'll just pick up on how I got involved in the secular movement. And that was just a little bit over a decade ago in the early years of the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. It occurred to me that the religious right in America was getting much too strong. I'm old enough to remember when the religious right was kind of born with the moral majority led by Jerry Falwell back around 1980 when Ronald Reagan got elected. And at that time, many people, including myself, thought that the religious right was kind of a passing phase, that it was a phenomenon that would quickly fade. But as we all know, in the ensuing decades, the religious right really only got stronger. It certainly did not just fade into history. And the election of George W. Bush in 2000 was a real wake-up call to me. It was a realization that something more affirmative had to be done to oppose the religious right and to fight back the policy and positions that the religious right and movement conservatism in general were pursuing. And I saw the secular movement as an underutilized tool in that regard. It occurred to me that there were no open atheists serving in Congress, that atheists and agnostics and secular humanists in general were rather marginalized in the public discourse in America, and that the emergence of that demographic as a visible demographic that deserves to be respected like everyone else and deserves to openly participate in politics like everyone else would be a very potent weapon against the religious right and movement conservatism. So I became involved in the American Humanist Association. I joined their board in 2005, became president in 2009, and now I serve as the organization's legal director.
Great, great. I mean, just to get into our dialogue, I would love to get your ideas on the institutional interests that promote the anti-intellectual kind of culture, whether they be governmental, corporate interests. I mean, would you just kind of give us a little bit of background there?
Sure. I wrote a piece for Psychology Today recently, and I think that might have been what led to your contacting me, called Anti-Intellectualism is Killing America, and one of the few pieces that I've written that truly went viral. And it seems to have resonated with people because it points out a root problem that often isn't talked about in America, and that is the problem of anti-intellectualism. As we political progressives and humanists look at the state of things in America, we often like to find a boogeyman. The Koch brothers, for example. If we could just effectively oppose the Koch brothers, we'd be all set. Or even the religious right. If we could just take on the religious right and put them in their place, public policy would start flowing in a much more progressive way. One thing I point out in the article and in my most recent book, Fighting Back the Right, is that the problem is deeper than that. And this problem of anti-intellectualism or the abandonment of reason in America is the underlying problem that leads to so much problematic public policy and just the social dysfunction and political dysfunction that you see in America. So one thing that I point out is that there is no one bad guy. There's no evil genius behind movement conservatism that gives it its motivation. That if we can just take care of that one problem, it'll go away. It's a more deeply rooted cultural problem. And you asked the question, what institutional interests are promoting it? That's the really interesting thing, is there is no just one institutional interest. There are many. Certainly the government is promoting anti-intellectualism in many ways. The institutional interests that gain from ordinary people being left out of the democratic process, the major corporations that use the Defense Department as a feeding trough, for example, that want to control government. They don't want government to be working for real human interests. They want government to be working for their corporate interests. The media, of course, gain an awful lot from the dumbing down of America and maximizing profit by having mindless programming that just kind of hypnotizes the masses. So there's many bad guys, and there's many root sources of anti-intellectualism, many interests that like to promote hyper-nationalism, for example, hyper-patriotism.
The mindless jingoism that we see going. It's incredible.
There's many corporate interests that benefit greatly from having a population that is just obsessed with materialism and consumption, buying things they don't need with money they don't have. You could argue that the entire American economy is dependent on that. That's a very problematic position to be in, and if we look at the common denominator behind all of this, the hyper-patriotism, the mindless consumption, the loss of government to corporate interests, and all these other problems, you can trace it back in one way or another to the abandonment of reason.
Agreed wholeheartedly. I mean, it's very, very interesting that, in this day and age, many erroneously accepted facts that have been comprehensively proven to be false, creationism, the idea that we all at some level have free will, even something, a creature of the left, the gender pay gap. However, these things still drive a lot of social policy, the legislation, governmental budget allocation, and day-to-day lives on both sides of the political spectrum. And of course, I do agree with you wholeheartedly that it's not a conspiracy. It's not the CIA or the government deliberately dumbing people down. It's a group of interests that individually all benefit in some way, shape, or form by having a population that doesn't question the status quo and is very, very keen on just mindless consumption. So my question to you is this: I mean, people find it very, very difficult to accept the concept of good without God, so to speak. Why do we still have things like let's say, creationism taught in the public school in this day and age, this late in the game?
Oh, that's a great question, and I wish I had the pinpoint answer to it, but I think most who try to explain the continuing popularity of fundamentalist religion usually point to people who are reacting to modernity, that there's a population out there that is just terrified of modernity and social progress and change, and therefore that population clings to fundamentalist beliefs. But it's certainly something that was not predicted by many people going back even just a generation or so. One thing that I point out in Fighting Back the Right is another book on anti-intellectualism that was written about 50 years ago by Richard Hofstadter called Anti-Intellectualism in American Society. It was a very popular book, and it won the Pulitzer Prize the year that it came out. I think it was 1961 or 62. And at the time, intellectuals such as Hofstadter were very optimistic because it was the Kennedy years. We had a president who seemed to genuinely enjoy ideas and intellectual debate, and he surrounded himself with advisors who were very much intellectuals from Harvard and Ivy League schools. And intellectuals such as Hofstadter were thinking, you know, American society, despite its history of anti-intellectualism, is finally rounding the curve. It seems like we're moving in the right direction. And he singled out the issue of creationism specifically, and he talked about it. And he said, you know, since the Scopes monkey trial a generation or so before he was writing the book, America has started to come to terms with evolution, and it seems like the American population is starting to accept evolution. You know, maybe there's a few hillbillies out there. This is 1962 or so that he's writing. Maybe there's a few hillbillies out there who still wrap themselves in creationism, but for the most part, American society has gotten past that, and they've started to accept evolution. Well, that was 50 years ago. You know, imagine what Hofstadter would think today, you know, half a century later, second decade of the 21st century, what he would think as we don't just have large swaths of the population that still cling to creationism, but we actually have presidential candidates, you know, serious major party presidential candidates who reject evolution and want to promote creationism in public schools. I think that really speaks to how far we've regressed. Instead, you know, we think naturally as time moves forward that there's progress or slow progress, but actually sometimes there are steps backward. And I would argue that the last generation or two, in many ways, not in every way, but in many ways, America has taken steps backward in the area of appreciation for intellectualism.
Agreed. One of the things I notice over here in the United Kingdom is that every once in a while there'll be a newspaper headline, and they'll say, "Is this the missing link?" So even when individuals accept evolution, there's still a very, very shaky grasp of evolution. I mean, so even when it's accepted, it's still not taught to any, with any degree of, I guess, rigor and depth in the public education system over here. And I guess my question to you is this. The things I'm seeing over here in the United Kingdom is that the avoidance of intellectual rigor or anti-intellectualism has had pretty negative social consequences. For example, when we look at the avoidance of fact-based sex education, are you noticing the same thing in the States over there?
Oh, definitely. I think probably more so, although I don't pretend to have my finger on the pulse of British society that well. I tend to think that the problem is worse here. We have sex education, for example, that is often anything but sex education. All they teach is abstinence and what they call biblical morality, which is kind of a funny term if you really think about it. But it's really problematic, and I don't know. I'm kind of curious how bad things are in England, but I don't think abstinence-only sex education is that widespread over there, is it?
Unfortunately, it is. Over here, again, I can only speak from my own experience. I don't have a very deep grasp of the entire curricula over in the UK, but just from my own experience, it's, you mustn't have sex, and of course, young people, they're entirely driven by their hormones. All they want to do is have sex. So there's very little discussion of how to have safe sex and what are the possible consequences. It's come from a very kind of narrow angle of, don't do this, and of course the children don't respond. So I think in the UK we have one of the leading teen pregnancy rates in the industrialized world. So whatever we're doing in terms of sex education clearly isn't working.
That's unfortunate. I know much of Western Europe has pretty liberal ideas as far as sex education goes. Scandinavia, I know for certain, and their teen pregnancy rates actually reflect a more or less enlightened young adult population. So I think they kind of show us the direction we need to go, but we have to get past the Bible thumpers in order to implement that kind of curriculum.
Agreed, agreed. And I've personally noticed that I meet a lot of individuals who will not only display a very shaky grasp of basic science, history, geography, but actually feel quite proud of this. I mean, is this a recent development, or?
I don't think it is recent, at least, again, speaking in terms of American culture. If you are familiar with American popular culture, going back a very long way, intellectuals have often been scorned in American culture, and the dumb lug, as they say, is often portrayed as the cool hero who gets the girl, that sort of thing. Whereas the academically inclined child is usually seen as kind of a nerd or a geek, as they say, that sort of thing. It really is a problem, and it kind of lays the foundation for a culture that just kind of rejects intellectual endeavor as a value.
For sure. I mean, I've even noticed, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, just the uptick in academic and media firings. For example, Sir Tim Hunt in the UK, who was forced to resign from his position at the University College London, when he basically, I think he pointed out that there were, gendered sex differences. And the same with Larry Summers, who pointed out that, hey, males tend to congregate towards the top of the field of mathematics, and they said, "Oh, that's neurosexism," and he said, "Well, no, this is a fact. This isn't sexism." But there's now a kind of party line, and anybody who doesn't toe that party line quickly loses their jobs. We see it for sure in the UK over here. Is it the same in the States?
Yeah, I think there is definitely an air of political correctness sometimes that seems to loom over public discourse. But, excuse me, one thing that I argue that I think really needs to be considered is the notion of, what it means to be against anti-intellectualism. One thing I point out in Fighting Back the Right is that realistically, we can't expect everyone to be an intellectual, right? I mean, that might be something to shoot for, but realistically, if we want to talk about goals that are within reach, the one thing we need to realize is that to be against anti-intellectualism, one need not necessarily be an intellectual. That's kind of a difficult concept to grasp, but I think one reason why culturally we've got so much anti-intellectualism is that the media tend to assume that everyone's an anti-intellectual if they're not an intellectual. And so they give, in other words, they give the working man and the working woman no respect. They assume that they must play to the lowest common denominator. They assume that arguments must be incredibly simplistic, almost based on sound bites instead of serious discourse. And one thing that I point out is that I come from a working class background myself, and I know many working class people who might not be all that educated, but they are certainly quite intelligent and capable of following arguments and understanding arguments if they are presented. The problem in America, and perhaps in Britain as well, is that there is no respect given to working people, so that those arguments and that serious discourse really isn't present. Instead, they're flooded with sound bites and that sort of thing, where there's just no serious public dialogue happening. And one thing that I argue is that we really need to pay attention and respect the masses, so to speak, and assume that the masses are capable of not necessarily embracing intellectualism, but rejecting anti-intellectualism, that the masses can be, the light switch can go on so that the masses realize when they are being pandered to, and when they are being talked down to, and when they are being disrespected, so that that crowd, that you know, we're talking about a democracy here, so that that democratic majority can reject anti-intellectualism and demand more, what I would argue, human-centered and progressive public policy.
Certainly. And just on the topic of democracy, I think it was Isaac Asimov, the author, who commented that anti-reason and anti-science have been infused into the political fabric, nurtured by a false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. And I just find that to be such an interesting quote. I guess my next question to you is this: the anti-intellectual bent that I see, at least over here in Europe, seems to be increasing despite the rising levels of formal education in the population, even among the very, very young, or especially among the very, very young. I mean, has the mission of the universities changed a little bit to not educating but training people to do jobs? I mean, what's the root of that? That, okay, we have more anti-intellectualism now, but people have more degrees and more master's degrees and more advanced degrees as well.
Yeah, well, I think in large part, much of what we call education in the West is really just training to participate in the economic order that's been constructed by corporate interests. There's not so much real intellectual endeavor. Another thing I point out in the book is, in America, compare how many business degrees are awarded every year to how many medical degrees are awarded every year. The ratio, and it's not on the tip of my tongue, but it's something like 15 to 1. It's well over 100,000 business degrees, perhaps a couple 100,000 business degrees are awarded every year, whereas really just a few thousand medical degrees are awarded. It shows, you know, our again, values in American society, you know, where our values are. If we can plug you into the business juggernaut, we're going to do it. And in terms of pay, the same thing. Any of the brightest minds who go to business school, you know, you graduate from an Ivy League business school, and you are going to be making great money, well into the 6 digits right out of business school. Whereas if you graduate with a medical degree, your pay is going to be much lower. You know, where does that, what kind of values does that reflect? I think it speaks for itself. And, you know, so the educational system, if you want to call it that, is really suspect in itself, because it's not promoting the level of intellectualism that we'd really want. Instead, it's promoting making money.
Certainly, and again, possibly this is something which is unique to the States, because I don't see a lot of it over here in Europe, but the universities have become, or perhaps they've always been, you know, part education, but also part, you know, college football team, college basketball team, you know, with, you know, it's a kind of system dedicated towards sports, and you know, the kind of primary function which at least a lot of individuals, including myself, assumed they had, was to educate and create open minds, so that you would have all of these open minds going into society, as opposed to a closed mind. I remember, for example, when I graduated, probably about a quarter of my classmates vowed to, quote unquote, never read a book again. And I thought that was crazy at the time, but, you know, but it just seems to be the done thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, the thing you say about colleges emphasizing sports. That's very true here in the States, as I'm sure you know. College football, college basketball, and, you know, college athletics are really just an arm of the advertising industry, because they get enormous ratings. Therefore, you know, they're broadcast nationally and followed very closely. But in many states, there's a meme going around, or a graphic that circulates on social media every now and then. It shows the highest paid state employee in each of the 50 states, and
Okay.
in the vast majority of states, the highest paid public employee is a coach for major sports. In other words, in Oklahoma, for example, the highest paid public employee is the coach of the University of Oklahoma football team. It goes like that from one state to another. There are very few states where the highest paid employee, for example, is the governor or some medical examiner, somebody who is not related to college sports.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have assumed actually the highest paid employee would be a political figure or possibly somebody in the medical field, but that's very, very interesting. What I have noticed is that the kind of anti-intellectual stream in society, despite their ignorance or on a particular matter, there's an assumption or there's a self-belief in these individuals or this block that they not only have the kind of authority to comment on everything, but to make sure their voices are heard above the rest, to drag down any opposing views through personal attacks, loud repetition, confrontation. Do you kind of see the same thing over in the States, that not only is it anti-intellectual, but it's incredibly vocal and relentless in its, pursuits of anything that tends to go against it?
I think so, and I think if you want to point to one of the reasons for that, we have to point to the medium that we're using right now, the internet. The internet has kind of made everyone an opinionator, if you will. Everyone is entitled to post their opinion and post it in the most ungraceful, tactless way, and there's really nothing that's going to stop you from it. So part of the problem might be, the media that's become available in the last generation, as opposed to, before the internet, if you wanted to rant, wanted to offer your opinion publicly, you had to sit down and write a letter to the editor and send it to your local paper. And of course, very few people had the will to do that. But now you can just unleash on your keyboard for a few seconds, and your opinion is out there for the world to see on Facebook or wherever else you happen to be posting. So, this is certainly a problem, but at the same time, we have to look at the internet as perhaps, one of the tools we can use to promote intellectualism. Or as I say, rather than necessarily promoting intellectualism, maybe the first step is to promote an awareness of anti-intellectualism. Let's teach people and show people when they are being pandered to and when they are being manipulated by the establishment and by various institutions. And maybe that awakening, that awareness of anti-intellectualism, will be a first step towards an appreciation of intellectual endeavor, one step at a time.
Certainly. I do know that, for example, in the States, there was a very, very famous court case in 2010, which I'm sure you're aware of, the Evans court case, which ruled that the government employees are not speaking as citizens for First Amendment purposes, within their employment. Now, in your opinion, does the legal situation possibly need to change there so that individuals do have a little bit more leeway to be able to voice concerns against an anti-intellectual bent? Or do we require other tools such as the internet to really, make a real stand here?
Well, I think public officials, generally speaking, are in a pretty good position, if they wanted to promote an awareness of anti-intellectualism. But the unfortunate reality in politics is that intellectualism pays off. Anti-intellectualism often pays off in politics. Talking down and dumbing down messages, especially as the Republican Party has evolved. And not that it's unique to the Republican Party, because the Democrats certainly engage in anti-intellectualism and benefit from it as well. But we've seen the Republican Party in the last generation go from, the party of big business and conservative interests to the party of wingnuts. I mean, we really have a party that seems to embrace anti-intellectualism with gusto, and just to use it as a fuel to drive itself. So I'd like to think that without major legal changes, we could still have politicians who help raise the level of dialogue.
So certainly, it does seem on some level that, let's say, a president who openly advocated creationism, I'm sorry, who openly advocated, evolution, would probably be unelectable. At least that's my gut reaction.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think maybe if he or she were too zealous in promoting evolution, he might turn off some voters. But I'd like to think that a president who kind of promoted intellectualism, and I'd have to say Barack Obama as a candidate back in 2008, seemed to promote himself as a man of reason and a man, not necessarily that he governed that way all the time, but, I don't think somebody with that kind of a message is necessarily unelectable. In America, you just have to be careful not to do anything that affirmatively confronts religion, because religion in America too often is still seen as above the fray and an area where criticism is not allowed.
I see, but because there's a very, very interesting situation in the UK, and from what I see within the political and social fabric over here, the UK isn't as driven by the religious rights. It's a little bit more secular, but even we'll have, the Prime Minister who got on television. I think it was about a month and a half ago, and he was addressing a congregation, and it was a televised talk, and he said almost word for word that it's essential now that Britain brings God back into politics and the legislative process and civil life, and I hope he's just pandering to that crowd, because there's always that element, right? But then there's a fear that hey, we may start seeing the rise of faith-based schools again, where they completely throw out reason, and they have a whole generation of children who are taught that the earth was created in 7 days, 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago.
Right.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunate that that kind of thing is still happening in Britain, because Americans look to Britain as, at least in the issue of secularism, as a more enlightened society. Of course, you don't have complete church-state separation there, but generally speaking, the population is seen as more secular, less enamored with religion. And when you start seeing the Prime Minister using rhetoric like that, you just have to shake your head. It's really a step in the wrong direction.
I agree wholeheartedly, and that is why I hope he was just pandering specifically to that crowd.
Well, he's pandering, but the fact that he is pandering is
exactly
because pandering sometimes works, and if it works once, then you start to see more of it.
Exactly. This has been a very, very interesting discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I think I'll just like to close with something that the late Murray Rothbard said, who's one of my favorite authors. He said, look, it's no crime to be ignorant of economics, which after all is a very, very specialized discipline, but it is totally irresponsible to have a loud voice and opinion on economic matters while remaining in the state of ignorance. And that's something I guess I see a lot over here, where people, just kind of proclaim very, very loudly on economic matters while deliberately never actually taking the time to really understand how does the economy work, how do economies grow. If you have an 80% tax rate, what does that do to productivity? And that is something I've always found to be very, very painful to see. Do you have the same issues in the US?
Certainly, everyone's an expert, right? That's what I'm to see. And once you start scratching the surface, you realize that there are usually reasons for these positions that have nothing to do with any serious economic analysis. So I think that's well said.
For sure, thank you. Well, it's been a real pleasure, David. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. Do you have any? Oh, pardon, sorry. Oh, sorry, there was just a bit of a delay, I think, there in the line. But thank you very much for joining us. Do you have any final things you would like to add, perhaps?
No, thank you for having me on, and maybe we can do it again sometime. Take care.
I would like that very, very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.